All right, good morning, class. I'm going to get right after this and try to finish up some of the comments that I didn't quite get to in class. And today we're talking a bit about mass, mass culture, mass society, and its links to mass production, mass consumption. We talked a little bit about advertising with the help of our reading assignment from our primary reader for today. And these are objectives. I'm gonna move through these things quickly. If you want to stop and revisit any of this, you can. And I started by trying to make the distinction yet similarity between propaganda and advertising. And really both of these are important developments of the mass society or mass culture that's taking place, or I should say that's becoming especially entrenched in the early 20th century. And it's important to understand the developments of this time through the lens of realizing that really it's a unique moment in world history where a large audience of people can be subjected or receiving of very similar messages. And advertising is a great example of that. We talked a little bit about these. I made these comments about mass production and mass consumption, the United States being the big winner of the interwar period in the sense that our economy was generating fully 1/3 of the world's industrial output. And that's noteworthy because Europe is in a bit of a swoon as a result of the destruction and lost infrastructure and capacity that World War I created for Europe, and this creates an opening and a niche for the United States to occupy. So the Great Depression, I mentioned it, the outward absolute, solid proof that the world was entering into a global financial crisis didn't really materialize until October of 1929 with the U.S. stock market crash. And that's worth noting because a lot of the unhealth in the global markets, the reason it was finding its way back to the United States was because the United States had been largely the financier or the banker of the world by this period of time. A lot of the loans and lending that were happening throughout the world were at least indirectly tied to the U.S. economy and U.S. banks. So a couple of the things that, a couple of the ways in which the war was a direct and indirect contributor to the global financial crisis of 1929 is just evident in the steps that European countries had to take to get themselves out from under the hardship of war and the consequences and the lost economic output, and in some cases the debt that resulted from it. And so European countries, Germany foremost among them, but European countries in general are trying to figure out how do we pay the bills with less money coming in. And so there's belt tightening, which affects the ability that European countries have to invest the capital to help drive economic growth. That's in very short supply. Similarly, particularly in the case of Germany, there's this debt that needs to be paid. And so the German government, one of its strategies, and governments oftentimes do this, for a time, you can print more money. You pay the bills with your newly created money supply. But that's a short-sighted step because when you print more money, you have more money competing for the same number of goods and services in circulation, and that always creates inflation. In fact, that's the definition of inflation, when you have more money pursuing or trying to purchase the same number of goods and services. It just means prices go up, and so these dollars that Germany was, or I'm sorry, these marks that the German government was printing were not any more valuable. In fact, each one was less valuable than the one before it, and this was a short-sighted approach. It created bank failures and closures because what starts to happen when people who are depositing their money in banks, or in this case when the United States is lending money to other governments around the world, when you start to run low, you can call in the loans, the money that people have borrowed from you. And when that happens, it creates all sorts of difficult ripples throughout the economy, because it quickly turns into panic, and then everyone is running on the banks. And banks really, I mean, they're designed around the premise that, sure, people are going to deposit money with us, and from time to time they're going to come and take some of the money that they've deposited with us and use it to buy things that they've been saving for. But the premise of banks is that not all the people are going to come at once to claim their deposits. And so the panic and unrest that people had about the security of their money contributes very much to the hardships that will follow. And because the banks and the economies that make up the global economy are all in a form of struggle at this time, it means that there's not money to keep buying as buyers had bought before, right? If you're suddenly your income is down, you're not going to continue buying things as you had in the past. And so world trade decreases tremendously. You see here that the United States, I mean, it's true, both global trade and U.S. trade, their ability, the United States economy witnesses its trade decline by 33%, essentially 1/3. Same thing in the world, and this is a terrible, terrible downturn. U.S. unemployment rate during this time gets as high as 25%. And 25%, while that's an absolutely horrific unemployment rate, that actually wasn't nearly as bad as it was in other European countries. The other thing that's going to happen here is the primary producer. So earlier in the course we were talking about how economies like Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, which are largely exporting commodities or raw materials, well, if nothing is being produced, if global output is shrinking by 1/3 because global demand for products is shrinking by 1/3, then that means there's a tremendous decrease in the demand for raw materials or commodities that primary producers in the developing world are producing. So the Great Depression becomes a really difficult moment for all countries. In fact, as bad as it was in the United States, it probably wasn't as bad in the United States as it had been for other parts of the world. So I want to go back just a little bit. You may or may not have noticed this in your reading, but there was an important part of the German delegation at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, and he was with David Lloyd George, who was the Prime Minister of Great Britain at the time. And this guy was an economist. His name was John Maynard Keynes. And he actually left the Paris Peace Conference in 1919 in something of a protest, because he heard the conversations that were going on among the French and British delegations. And he feared that the really harsh economic conditions and penalties that Great Britain and France were imposing upon Germany was a recipe for disaster. So almost immediately after the conference, Keynes starts criticizing what took place. And essentially what he argues is that in times of hardship for the global economy, the last thing that governments should be doing is belt tightening or austerity measures or reducing their spending. Keynes actually believed, and his beliefs started a school of economics that bears his name, Keynesianism. Keynes believed that at times of economic hardship, government should actually engage in spending. They should try to take up the slack that the private sector is unable to provide. And so Keynes has already taken some important historical action. And here we have him again. It's about 20 years later. You can see he looks a little bit older. And this is Keynesian economics at its height, because what Keynes is going to argue in the United States, and the U.S. won't be the only country to take up this strategy, he calls it pump priming. You could also call it belt loosening. And the idea is that if governments spend when private corporations or companies, businesses, are unwilling to spend, it will have a increased impact, a stimulating impact upon the economy. And so in places like Germany, and we'll see this when we get to looking more closely at what Hitler does, places like Italy with Mussolini, and places like in the United States under FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, there are going to be a number of government policies that try to put more money into circulation. And you'll see here when FDR becomes president, in his first 100 days, starting in 1933, he puts forth a whole raft or a whole set of different pieces of legislation that are aimed at putting money in the pockets of American workers, that the hope being that they will stimulate the economy. Now, this pump priming probably works to a certain extent. It might even help save capitalism a little bit from itself at this time. But it's worth noting that the U.S. economy doesn't totally recover from the Great Depression until early on during World War II. So we can't say that the New Deal itself salvaged the American economy. I guess in the case of Germany, you can say that Hitler's willingness to spend and prime the pump and expand the military and industry of Germany did have a tremendous positive short-term impact on the German economy. Let's see, do we have anything else? We don't need to worry about this. I guess I will point out, though, that the Dust Bowl begins at the same time in the 1930s, and it takes a difficult situation and makes it all that much worse. Okay, so with that, I'm going to call it good. Thanks for hearing me out, and tomorrow we'll get together and move on further into the interwar period and look at some of the steps that different governments throughout Europe and beyond take to sort of steady the ship during this highly unstable time. All right, thank you.